Right. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Nice to see everybody here this morning. Nice to see our regulars. Second, let me get my screen done properly. There we go. Nice to see everyone here this morning. Elian and Danny and Debbie and lots of other regulars here. Of course, Martin and Shirley, staunch pillars of this Shia. The regulars, Michael Gross, nice to see you all. It's I'm still waiting impatiently for the chance to get together properly in person around the table. That seems to be a dream which is not going to happen quite as soon as I thought it would. But please God, in the near future, it's I think that's something that we can look forward to. Please God. That's how the Shia started off, Ellie, right? We started off the Shia in person. For the first year or so, we did it in person. And then we were forced to go back to Zoom. And a few months ago, we thought that maybe it was all over. But I'm afraid, I think even as of this week, I'm told that Bar Ilan University and other universities have gone back to Zoom. In other words, they went back to in-person lectures for a few months. But now they've reverted back to Zoom because of the spread of to try and limit the spread of the infection. So I suppose we've got to stick with it as well. We're learning Sefer Bereshis, and but I think I just want to mention very briefly a topic which is really rocking the rabbinic world in Israel at the moment, which is the tragedy and disaster of Chaim Walder, the famous author. Chaim Walder, who was really in the Haredi world, in the Frum world, he was really an icon and a celebrity and somebody who was greatly trusted, particularly as a therapist for children and for Shalom Bayis issues. And he was somebody who was really hailed as the new face, really, of Orthodox Judaism in Israel, more open-minded and psychologically aware, and suddenly the news broke that actually behind that facade, behind that he was a predator and a sexual offender, and it's difficult to overstate the impact that's had on the whole Orthodox world here in Israel and worldwide. His books sold worldwide and were loved. Everybody's got children and grandchildren who grew up on his books and have his books next to their bed and love them and read them and get inspired by them. And he was an extremely gifted writer and a journalist. And then it turns out that he had a dark side to his person. Now, the truth is, I already heard rumors about his dark side many years ago. I think many Rabbonim heard rumors already 4 or 5 years ago that he was not reliable in private therapy. But nevertheless, people refused to believe it. And now it's really, the Rabbonim heard so many multiple testimonies. If one person comes and testifies against somebody that he behaved badly, so you can think, well, maybe it's true, maybe it's not true, maybe it's a fantasy, maybe it's imagined. But then when you have 2, 3, 4, 5 people, all of whom don't know each other, coming and giving exactly the same testimony, it's inescapable, right? Chazal already speak about this in the Gemara and in the Shulchan Aruch, that once you have these shemuos, ro'os, once you have bad testimonies about somebody which is repeatedly confirmed again and again, then there is no doubt left at all about his behavior. And if there was the slightest doubt left, his own suicide really put the lid on it. The idea that he took his life is just something almost beyond belief. And everybody's really going around saying, what should we tell our children? I've got grandchildren who grew up on his books. I've got my daughters and my sons who've got children, really all had his books all over the place. And now I have thrown his books out into the garbage in order not to leave any remnant of this really evil man in the house. But there are lots of people who are still in denial, lots of people, even Rabbonim, who are still in denial, and they can't believe that it's happened. But that's just a question of time, I think, that people will realize that the primary obligation of Rabbonim and of the Jewish community is to protect vulnerable people and to make sure that predators don't exploit their power over them. And it's a very, very sad story, I must be honest with you. But it's something which one has to really just understand that I just find it very interesting, just as a personal comment. I've seen it a few times, that people who are regular, very good people at a certain stage of their life and later on become celebrities and multimillionaires, something happens often in their brain. I don't know what it is exactly that happens in their brain. Something happens in their brain that they feel that they are beyond reproach. No one will ever criticize them. They can do what they like. They're no longer subject to the laws of human morality. And that is really a really terrible, I've seen this several times. People who become very wealthy, very famous, and suddenly start behaving in a most disgusting way. It's a very, very weird situation. But it's important, I think, to be able to tell children particularly, and also other vulnerable men and women who go to therapy, that if somebody in power takes advantage of you or starts doing things that makes you feel uncomfortable, then one has to really not hesitate for a moment and report it to the authorities and make an issue out of it, because sadly these things are out there. And I just wanted to mention this in the shir because it's on my mind, and I've been listening to various different talks given by different Rabbonim around the country. All the various different Rabbonim are addressing this issue, how to really protect oneself against people like that, and how sadly some of the Rabbonim are still in denial. It can't be true, must be some mistake, etc. But sadly, I think that's just that's a fairy tale, and that's people living in a make-believe world that nothing can be, that it can't be true that someone of that stature behaved so badly. But sadly, it can be true, and it was true, and it's been confirmed. At the time when it became public, the Dayanim had already listened to 22 separate complaints from victims of his abuse. Since that time, as of 2 days ago, another 18 have come forward. And I have a feeling there's going to be many more. So we've already got 40 independent testimonies of people who were badly treated and who were abused in one way or another by this man, who on the surface seemed to be the most wonderful new sort of face of enlightened Orthodox Jewish life, but actually was something of a monster in his private life. A very, very sad situation indeed. And it'll take a while for many people to recover. Lots of kids need counseling. Their favorite books have been taken away from them. The man who was on their lips all the time, Chaim Walden books, and they were reading them, and there were public readings, and kindergartens and primary schools all over the country had reading sessions from his books, and the children were encouraged to read them themselves. It was really a phenomenon like I've never seen before. I mean, in the Orthodox world of any author of any sort, and yet that's what's happened to us in recent days, and it's extremely, extremely sad. Okay, I mean, I don't know if there's anything anybody wants to add to that or question it, but it's certainly something which is going to continue for a long time. My guess is that more and more people will come forward if he's been really a predator for so many years. And,
I have a question, Rabbi.
Yeah.
What's wrong with our system? How is it that this predator was going unchecked? Like how he could have gotten for years, years.
Yeah,
And
Judith,
like,
this is a question.
System that right away with the first incidents, he wasn't stopped in his tracks, and his reputation was already on the line and in question. How he could have perpetrated. That's my question.
All I can say to you, Judith, is this is a question that is on everybody's lips, being discussed. How come it wasn't dealt with earlier? How come this wasn't dealt with earlier? I don't know the answer to that question, other than to say he was phenomenally clever in covering his tracks, extremely clever. And also, when there were rumors, his reputation was so strong, positively strong, that people just couldn't hear it. They just didn't listen to it. They just could not hear that it was possible that a man of that status could. I'd like to add, though, for example, he was never considered to be a Rosh Yeshiva or a Rov or a Talmud Chacham or a Pesach. He never really had any rabbinic status in any real sense. We're not dealing with somebody who was ever a great Talmud Chacham or a great tzaddik. He was an extremely, extremely gifted writer and psychologist, and he did indeed help lots of people and wrote beautiful, beautiful works. You know what, ladies and gentlemen, I think we'll end there. I'm not going to go into an analysis of this. It's not the topic of my share today, but it is a topic which one has to have clarity about it and not be. It's important not to be confused by, sadly, some Rabbonim who are in denial that this happened or that it could have happened. Sadly, it has happened, and even to tell children that a man has committed suicide, a man that they loved and worshipped has taken his own life, even that by itself is forget all his, apart from all the abuse that he committed, the fact that he took his own life is unbelievable. It's really beyond our understanding. And of course, somebody mentioned, of course, we have a lot of Rahmanas on his family. That's certainly true. But I think the primary Rahmanas is on his victims, not on his family, but on his victims. And the fact that he's taken his own life, what Chazal speak about, I mean, sadly, suicide is something which is associated with people who are psychotic or deeply in the grip of depression. Somebody who was deeply depressed and commit suicide, we understand that that was really something beyond his control. But this man wasn't depressed. You can see from his suicide note, he wasn't depressed at all. He just couldn't face the music. He just realized that he'd done something terrible and he didn't want to face up to it. And that is just really something really, really terrible. Just to give you an idea, in Chazal, on the subject of people taking their own life, if you look in Shulchan Aruch, in Yeridei Shin Lamed Hey, so it speaks about someone committing suicide, that one doesn't sit shiva for them, one doesn't do kriya, one doesn't say kaddish. I mean, the person is considered to have been a murderer if he takes his own life under circumstances. As I say, if someone is psychotically ill, then that's a different story completely. Then that's something beyond his control. But in a situation where he did it in cold blood, so to speak, just out of an unwillingness to face a criticism, I think that is really also, for me, as bad as all the other aspects of it.
What about the rabbis who knew this and they told him to stop it? Why didn't they stop it?
This is an exceptionally good question. An exceptionally good comment. It seems that there were some Rabbanim who knew it and who tried. I think they possibly overestimated their own influence, and they thought that if they could tell him, we know about it, you must stop doing it, and he says, yes, 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 of course I'll stop doing it, I regret it and I won't do it anymore, they thought that was the end of the story. Possibly, this was simply a situation which they underestimated the depth of the problem. That's it. That's the end of this subject. I know most of us are a bit sick of the subject, and so am I, frankly. And I'd rather learn a little bit of Torah together. But we have to face the realities of the generation we're living in, and realize that this is a mega problem, which is, my guess is, it's only going to get bigger over the next few months, not smaller. Okay, we are learning, as you all know, we are learning Sefer Bereshis, but we're learning Sefer Bereshis from a particular angle to see the way Chazal learned Sefer Bereshis, and that they saw in it the roots of future events. So we're particularly at the moment looking in Parshas Lech Lecha, chapter 14. And just to remind you, we looked at two topics recently. We looked at the meeting with Malki Tzedek Melech Shalem and the Chazal telling us the origins of the name Yerushalayim. And we also looked at the question about why Avrom risked his life to save Lot. And I promised you that we would look at some writings of the Netziv. The writings of the Netziv. Netziv is an acrostic, Rashi Tevis, of Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. He was, and we'll speak more about him in a minute, but his commentary on the Chumash, and particularly on Bereshis, is really a masterpiece, the Ha'amek Dovar, and we're going to be looking at his introduction to Bereshis. But before I do that, I just want to have another look at some of these psukim, because there are in them some very interesting, if you like, foundations of the future of Klal Yisrael and the future of Torah. What exactly happens when Avrom meets Malki Tzedek? Chazal saw this as a crucial moment in the book of Bereshis. It only covers a few psukim, but some very important things happen. Let's have a look at the psukim again, just to remind ourselves. So you have here, okay, bear with me for 1 minute. Going to have to get it up there. Second. Share the screen, back to my screen. Let's try and do this now. Share screen, very good. Okay, can you see a text? Yes? Good. Okay. So what we looked at was these psukim here, that Avram goes into battle and saves Lot and his family from being prisoners of war. And then we had this pasuk, Malki Tzedek Melech Shalem Hotzi Lechem V'Yayin V'Hu Kayin L'Keil Elio. So Malki Tzedek comes out, and he is the king of Shalem. And we looked at the Ramban and Rashi, who said here, you can see that Melech Shalem is Yerushalayim. But what does it mean, V'Hu Kohen L'Keil Elyon? So what does it mean? The pasuk here says that he gave him Meiser. So it says, so he gives, at the end of the story, second, where does it say? Second, V'Hu Melech Shalem. Let's have a look here at the Ramban. So it says here, V'Hu V'Hizkir V'Hu Kain L'Eil Elyon Lahudia Ki Avrom Lo Hoyon Nosein Meiser L'Kain L'Kim. So we find here for the first time somebody giving Meiser to a Kayin. This is also a remez to the future of Klal Yisrael. Where is the pasuk? Excuse me, just 1 second. I think I saw it on page 2. We had that pasuk, didn't we? Second, I seem to have lost it on my screen. Oh, here it is. Here it is. So Malki Tzedek says the following statement: Ubaruch Keil Elio. He gives blessing to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And I've mentioned to you before that the phrase Keil Elyon was coined by Malki Tzedek, and found its way into our davening, right? Like we referred to Hakadosh Baruch Hu as Kel Elyon, Hashem migein sorechu b'yodecha, who delivered your enemies into your hand. And here comes the interesting phrase, Vayiten lo maisa mikol. And Avrom gave to Melchizedek maisa. He gave him a tenth of his winnings or his earnings or his wealth, exactly a tenth of what isn't specified here. But in some say he gave him maisa. And this was a new idea. In other words, Avram was recognizing Melchizedek as having a status of a kohen, right? But, right, and as a result of which, Avram gives Maisa to, so this is also in Sefer Bereshis, a very important, if you like, origin, a very important paradigm of the future of Klal Yisrael and the Kohanim. So the Ramban here says, and here he says, here, this is the passage I'm looking interested here in the Ramban. It says, so there's a remez in this passage that Avram knew, right, that the location where he was standing would one day become the Har Habayis. V'shom Yotzi Zaro HaMaisa, and there, at some future date, Zaro, meaning his descendants, Avram's descendants, will give Maisa and Truma, V'shom Yevarechu es Hashem. In other words, the relationship, the relationship that developed later between the Jewish people and the Kohanim is already, there's a prefiguration here, there's a premonition here of what was going to be in the future. And that's one of the amazing things in Sefer Bereshis. We see here that Avram knew there was going to be Kohanim, there's going to be Yerushalayim, there's going to be Maisa. And Maisa was a key feature of the relationship between Klal Yisrael and the Kohanim. The question is, an interesting question is, what happened to Melchizedek? Why did Melchizedek, in fact, not become going forward, part of the Jewish people? And if he was a Kohen L'Kel Elyon and a bona fide Kohen L'Kel Elyon, somewhere along the line, he must have been derailed in order not to become part of the future of the Jewish people. Don't forget, Avram is laying down the foundations of the future of Klal Yisrael. And suddenly he meets this man who is a Kohen L'Kel Elyon, who's completely dedicated and lives a life of purity and of Kedusha and dedicated to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What was his mistake? So here's a very interesting thing. If you have a look at what exactly Melchizedek says Vayevarchehu, right? And he in this case is Melchizedek. He blesses Avram and he says, Baruch Avram L'Kel Elyon. I'm blessing Avram in the name of the Most High, Kohen Shamayim Haaretz, right? And then he says, Ubaruch Kel Elyon. And then I thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for protecting him and for protecting you. So there's a very interesting, this one we've learned already. That is the, second. Sorry, 1 second. Oh, so let's have a look at this. This is a Gemara in Sota. This is a very interesting, I think, a very interesting insight of Chazal, if you like, with the one that I've, Omer Reb Zerachia Mishum Rabbi Yishmael. So, Rabbi Yishmael, so we're dealing with the Tanoim, the insight of the Tanoim into these psukim. Bikesh HaKadosh Baruch Hu lahotzi kahuna mishein. That there was a plan A, there was an original plan that indeed Shem would become a partner with Avram Avinu, and that Avram Avinu's children would be the future of the Jewish people, but not the Kohanim. And the Kohanim separately would come from Shem. That Shem would be the progenitor, he would be the ancestor of the Kohanim. in the future. So the Chazal understood that this statement in Parshas Lech Lecha is quite a radical statement, that Shem had the potential to be the father of all future Kohanim. But he made a mistake here. I'll be honest with you. What was his mistake? His mistake was, the Gemara here says, Kivan shehiktim birkas Avraham lebirkas hamakah. Hotziu me'Avram. So what did he do? When he meets Avram Avinu, he first thanks Avram and blesses Avram, and then he blesses HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Then he blesses HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Right? Say Chazal, that was such a fundamental error that he showed that he was too, if you like, beholden to Avram. He gave priority to Avram Avinu in a situation where he shouldn't have. And I think this is very interesting. You have here a crucial moment in the history of Klal Yisrael, right? Where somebody appears on the scene and has an enormous potential to be a future ancestor of part of Klal Yisrael, and he loses it for a particular reason. We haven't got really time to go into this in depth, but it is interesting the comment of Chazal that what he shouldn't have done, he shouldn't have thanked Avraham before he thanked HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I must tell you, I say this sometimes to congregants of mine who are before Simchas. If I know a congregant of mine is going to get up and speak at a wedding or something like that, at a mitzvah, and is going to thank his wife and thank his parents and thank the caterer and do the whole sort of Oscar-winning performance thank you list of all the people to who he owes gratitude to, he should start off his talk by saying Chazdei Hashem. That's what he should. When you start off thanking people, you should first thank. That's what this Gemara is saying. You should start off by saying Chazdei Hashem, Baruch Hashem, we are here, Shechianu, V'kimanu, V'giyanu. Kadosh Baruch Hu has given us the life and the privilege to celebrate this chas, celebrate this simcha, whatever it is, and then move on to thank everybody. That's absolutely fine. But it's interesting, this Gemara picks up that Malki Tzedek, with all his great potential and all his great status as being a Kohen, a Keil Elyon, made this mistake. He was too involved in expressing gratitude to other people, and for 1 second, he lost his priorities. The priority should be whenever you get up to want to thank somebody, well, it's important to remember that the first thing to do is like Birkas HaShachar in the morning. Before you do anything else, you thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu that you've woken up and that you're functioning and that you've got another day, you've got a gift of life. And then you can go on and of course, and thank everybody that you see. But giving the priority, right? It's like under the chuppah, you want to give blessings to the chassan and the kala. They should live together. But the first thing we say is shehakoil boro lichroid. That's the first thing. Before we start thanking anybody or giving people blessings to live a happy and fulfilled life, the first statement has to be, the first bracha, shehakol boro lichroid. That everything that we're doing for kvod shamayim, and we're living in a world of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And to learn and to train oneself to say that first, that is part of the lesson of this particular piece of Chumash, where Malki Tzedek appears. And yes, is he going to be as a partner with Avram Avinu in building Klal Yisrael? Yes. No, he blows it. He misses the opportunity because for some reason he feels too strongly a gratitude to another person rather than to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So that's what we start. Incidentally, under the chuppah, people think the first bracha of the Shema brachas is Bar Pri Hagafen. That's actually not true. The first bracha is Shakol Bro Lichvoide. That's the first bracha. The Bar Pri Hagafen, historically, for those people who are interested in the history of halacha, historically, the Bar Pri Hagafen was added on to the to the chuppah marriage celebration many centuries later, time of the Gaonim or the Rishonim. If you look at the Gemara in Ksuvas, the Gemara in the first chapter of Ksuvas tells us how to make brachas under the chuppah, right? And under the chuppah, it tells us it doesn't use the phrase Shema brachas. There is no Shema brachas. I don't know if I mentioned it before in this shir at all, but we're so used to the phrase Shema brachas that we count 7 brachas, right? And we say Shema brachas, and we make Shema brachas, and we invite people to Shema brachas. The Gemara never uses the word Shema brachas, and there's a good reason for it, because in the Gemara, there are only 6 brachas. There aren't 7 brachas. In Chazal, it's only 6 brachas. So next time, ladies and gentlemen, you want to invite somebody to your house, invite them for the 6 brachas. And it doesn't quite sound the same, though, does it? I think you'll agree with me that Shema brachas. What do you think, Henry? It sounds a bit better, Shema brachas, than 6 brachas. I think you'll agree with me that we don't go under the chuppah and say 6 brachas. We say Shema brachas, but actually the first bracha is got nothing, is not part of the Shema brachas. That's incidentally why the poskim say that if you're machabed people to give brachas, you shouldn't ask someone just to say the Bar Pri Hagafen by itself. You should always ask someone to give the first 2 brachas, because the real first bracha is, in fact, for us, the second bracha. The Bar Pri Hagafen is halachically incidental. It's not really a kibud to ask someone to make the Bar Pri Hagafen, right? And therefore, we have the custom to give the first 2 brachas together in order to give someone the kibud of the first of the 6 brachas, right, which comes packaged together with the Bar Pri Hagafen. It's very interesting. At some later stage, in probably at the time of the Rishonim, the same is true, incidentally, with a bris milah. In the Gemara in Shabbos, in Perek Rabbi Eliezer Milah, it gives us all the brachas that we say. Asher Kiddush, he did me better, and V'chod b'she'iroi som, the brachas of the bris milah. There's no mention of Bar Pri Hagafen in Chazal. There is no Bar Pri Hagafen in a bris milah. Later on, it was decided to add the Bar Pri Hagafen. So you have here an interesting feature. Anyhow, all this is just as an aside, but the main point that's relevant to the Chumash that we're learning is that what we learned from the mistake of Malki Tzedek Melech Shalem is that before we say anything, we say Shehakol Bara Lechvod. Before we say anything, we thank first HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and it's worth making a mental note, ladies and gentlemen. Some of you, Be'ez Hashem, will have simchas, family simchas, and you'll get up to speak. And it's important that the opening verse, opening sentences should not be thanking your friends and your parents and your wife and your husband or whatever it is, but the first thing should be the thanks, acknowledgement of Chazdei Hashem. Okay, let's go back a little bit to our text here. So that's what the Gemara here says. Kivan shehiktim birkas Avrom, birkas Amakom, Hotzir Avrom. Because he made that mistake, that was it. He lost his status. Right? And the Gemara actually gives us a little bit of a dialogue between him and Avrom, that Avrom says to him, that Avrom gives him Musa. According to this Gemara here in Sota, it says that Avrom said to him, V'chi makdimim birkas eved lebirkas kainai. That Avrom says to him, what are you talking about? Do you first give praise to the servant before you give praise to his master? So Avrom gives him Musa, right? And that's what the Gemara here says, and that's why the pasuk says, "V'hu kohen Elio," that he was a kohen, but not. So the Gemara here says, but his descendants weren't. His descendants could have been, but they weren't because of this mistake that he made. I'm sure there's much more to this, but I think it's an interesting. Right now, here's so I wanted to show you. So we've already seen in this little tiny episode of a few psukim, we've seen several different references to the future of Klal Yisrael. One of them is, we saw in Rashi, that Rashi says that he brought him lechem v'yayin because he had a ruach hakodesh, that in the Beis Hamikdash there would be the minachos and the nesachim, that part of the avodas Hashem would be the wine libations and the flour of the minachos. That's the one. The second one is the name of Yerushalayim. We saw is a shalem. The third one is Vayigishna Maisa. That Maisa is an important future halacha of connecting the Kohanim to Klal Yisrael. And now we see that also we're learning how to give priority to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But now I want to have a look at one more pasuk here before we go to the Netziv. So in the end, let's have a look at these psukim. Vayoma melech Sodom and Avrom. So Avrom has just won the battle and restored the prisoners of war, the people of Sodom. So the king of Sodom says to Avrom, "Teili hanefesh barachush kachloch." And you can take in the ancient world, if you won a battle, you had a right to the spoils of war. This was part of the ethics of war in the ancient world, not so much today. In the modern world, we don't go for the spoils of war, but Avram had a right to claim the spoils of war. So Avram says, no. Avram says, right, Harimosias Yodi. He made a shavua, he lifted up his hand in an oath, and what did he say? A famous statement. He said, I'm not going to take anything. Not a thread and not a shoelace am I going to take. I'm not going to take anything of yours. Below Toma ani hershati as Avram. You shouldn't say that I made Avram rich. Exactly why Avram wasn't willing to take from this war is a subject of some debate, because we do find, for example, that Avram was willing to accept wealth from Paro in the story with Sarah, that Avram became rich from Paro's gifts. But the Meforshim here say, Tamim and others say, that since Avram realized that this whole battle was a nace, the fact that he, with his small group of warriors, could overpower such a massive army was miraculous, and one shouldn't benefit personally from Maisa Nissa. That's a whole separate discussion I don't want to go into for the moment, but I call upon it. What's interesting is that Avram makes this comment. He said, and this was seen to be a comment of great significance, that Avram Avinu had the possibility to become massively wealthy. He just won a massive battle and there was massive wealth available to him. And he said, no, thank you. Restore everything to their original owners. And that was considered to be an act of modesty of the highest level. Right? There was an act where he could have taken, but he said, look, he was moicha. He didn't want to overindulge. Right? There is, Chazal have a word for this, referred to generally as the quality of prishut. Prishut means not to overengage in material goods, not to overindulge. He actually now says, but he does say that the people who fought with him, they should be rewarded. In other words, he was willing to meichel his part, but he says, Bill or die, right? I don't want anything. So he had three loyal assistants, Oner, Eshkol, and Mamre, about whom we know very little, but they seem to be his neighbors and his allies. So let them. What's interesting is this word. I like this word. This word in the Torah is an interesting word. Bil Adai. Who else says Bil Adai? For 5 points, ladies and gentlemen. Any offers? Who says this word Bil Adai?
Bilam.
Yosef.
Yosef, Paro says to Yosef, you are the most amazing person I've ever met, and your interpretations of dreams and your plans for the economic future of this people, that's unbelievable. So Yosef says, Bil Adai, it's not me. I'm a shliach of HaKadosh Baruch. So the word Bil Adai is Yosef possibly learnt this phrase from his Alter Zayda, right, from Avrom Avinu. That Avrom Avinu, when offered greatness and power and wealth, used this phrase. Bil Adai means it's not for me. I don't want any part of this greatness. It's not for me. It's for somebody else. So Yosef, it's an expression of anova, and that anova expresses itself in lots of different ways. And one of them is not accepting, refusal to accept great wealth and power. In my comments at the beginning of this share on the other topic that I won't mention again, I did mention that great wealth and power often comes with a sting in the tail, often has the effect of driving people mad. And possibly that's part of this as well, that the Gedolei Yisrael were very careful not to ever indulge in wealth and power because of the potential damage spiritually, mentally, psychologically that it can do to a person. Okay, but here's an interesting piece of Gemara that I just want to learn with you, and then we'll have a quick look at the Netziv. So this is a Gemara in Nedarim. Nedarim Daf Lamed Beis speaks at length about this whole episode and makes the following statement. Second. No, I'm sorry. The Gemara I want to look at now is a Gemara in Sota. Right? This is a Gemara in Sota. And the Gemara says as follows. Everybody with me? The Gemara here, I'm highlighting it now. Right? The Gemara says, Dorash Rova. Rava said, B'schar sha'aba Avrom Avinu, as a reward for what Avrom Avinu said to Melchizedek and to the king of Sodom. What did he say? He said, Im michut v'ad saroch now, that I'm not even going to take a thread or a shoelace from you. I'm going to restore it all to its original owners, even though he had a right to it. Zachu bonov l'shtei mitzvos. This was the origin of two mitzvahs which his descendants were given by HaKadosh Baruch. And what are they? So the word chut means a thread, and that, of course, the Gemara here says is the chut shel techeles. That is the thread of techeles of the tzitzis, right? So the thread of the techeles of the tzitzis, which is one of the Tariq mitzvahs, as we all know, this was given to Klal Yisrael, says the Gemara here, in acknowledgement of Avram Avinu's modesty and his his willingness to forego material wealth and power. And what's the Soroch Na'al? So the Gemara here says, Ritzua shel tefillin, the straps of the tefillin, right? The straps of the tefillin, which we tie onto our arm and head, those straps have an interesting connection to Avram Avinu. Now it's true, tzitzis and tefillin we wear because it's a mitzvah in the Torah, post Sinai. But what I want to show you, I think this is just a very interesting example, how Chazal understood that even though all the mitzvahs that we were given of Shabbos and Yom Tov and tzitzis and tefillin and everything were post Har Sinai, but in some small way, the shoresh, the root of these mitzvahs goes back to the Avos. In some small way, there were certain things that Avos did which laid foundations for future mitzvahs. And the chut shel techeles, and dafka the techeles is the blue thread, recently rediscovered and reinstated in Klal Yisrael, and I recommend to everybody to look into it and avail themselves of it. The techeles is the blue thread and represents the spiritual element of life, right? The spiritual element of life in the tzitzis, that is the the tcheles, which, as Rashi says, it's connected to the kisei hakovod. But the origin of it is Avrom Avinu using this as an expression. I'm not even going to take a thread from you. So whereas this statement, of course, has got nothing to do with tzitzis and tefillin, that Chazal joined the dots in a very interesting way. That we every day, every Jewish man puts on tzitzis and tefillin. The minhag is for women not to do tzitzis and tefillin, incidentally. But that's the practice in Klal Yisrael. Technically speaking, halachically, if I'm not being recorded, I can say to you that technically speaking, halachically, a woman could put on both tzitzis and tefillin. But it's not also for a woman to wear tzitzis or tefillin. But women are exempt from tzitzis and tefillin. They're not excluded from tzitzis and tefillin. But the practice over the centuries and millennia is that women have not adopted that practice. It's interesting because some things which women are exempted from, women have adopted. Like, for example, sitting in the sukkah. Sitting in the sukkah halachically has got the same status for women as putting on tzitzis. Right? In both cases, the woman is exempt from the mitzvah, but she can do it if she wants. And if she does do it, a woman can make a bracha. But tzitzis, the practice of tzitzis and tefillin is for women not to do that, for whatever reason it is. That's a subject for a separate shir, why it is that over the years women have adopted not to wear tzitzis or tefillin. But halachically, it's important to know that it's not forbidden for a woman to wear it. It's important to know that. It's an important idea, and that in actual fact, it's only not done by women because it's a mitzvah asay shezman garama. It's a time-bound mitzvah. That's the only reason why women don't wear tzitzis and tefillin. But I call upon him, the origins of tzitzis and tefillin are with Avrom Avinu. Avrom Avinu, and it's got to do with his ability to be moichel, to forego the possibility of great wealth and to restore the property to their original owners. And that was a great Kiddush Hashem. And in that sense also, tzitzis and tefillin is a Kiddush Hashem. Wearing tzitzis and tefillin is a great blessing that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has given us. And in its essence, it dates back to Avrom Avinu. And that if you make a list of all the things we get out of this very small episode here of Avrom and Melchizedek, we can make a list of 12 features of this story, all of which were laying the foundations for the future of Klal Yisrael. What I'd like to do now in the last 10 minutes of the Shia is to have a look for a minute at the Netziv. Okay, just give me a minute. I'll get up on the screen. Okay. Share the screen. Okay, got a text? Yes, you can see a text? Okay. You should know that every time I get a text up on the screen, I'm very proud of myself. You know, that I've learned the technology of all this. Let's just have a look for a minute at this person. This person played an exceptionally important role in the last generation of the Jewish people, and particularly in terms of Jewish life in Israel. And Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, you can see he lived in the 19th century. So if you have a look at the blurb that I've given you at the top, he was the Rosh Yeshiva of Volozhin from 1854 until it closed in 1892. And Volozhin, as I mentioned before, was the engine room of the whole Lithuanian yeshiva world. And out of it grew all sorts of other yeshivas, Telz, Ponovich, Mir, Slobodka, all of which were spin-offs of the Volozhin yeshiva. And the Netziv was an exceptionally important figure in the building of, as the Rosh Yeshiva the Rosh Yeshiva. And he brought in, for example, Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, Reb Chaim Brisker, who revolutionized the way the yeshivas learn Gemara and learn halacha. And he was brought in by the Netziv. The Netziv worked with Reb Chaim Brisker to create the most remarkable, high standard yeshiva in the world. He's also the author of the Hamikdavar, you can see in the third line that I've mentioned here. But here, what I've mentioned in these lines here, I just like to highlight this for a minute, because if you think about it, his Talmidim really changed the face of Jewish life in the land of Israel. And it was only because the Netziv himself, was somebody who understood the importance of the land of Israel and building up the land of Israel. He didn't live to see the 20th century, but in the 19th century, he already understood that the Yishuv in Israel in the 20th century had to be strengthened in its Torah learning. There had to be more. So look at these three Talmidim of his. One of them is Avrom Yitzchak Cohen Cook, right? That Rav Cook was a Talmid of the Netziv, and from the Netziv, he learned a love for the land of Israel, a love of Torah, and he learned how to be a Lamdan and how to appreciate the highest levels of learning. And of course, Rav Cook came to Israel and established eventually Mecca as Rav Cook and a whole hashkafa, a whole Torah hashkafa about religious Zionism and building Torah in Israel. The second person here, maybe not so well known to people, is Rav Issa Zalman Meltzer, who was also, these three Rabbonim, Rav Cook, Rav Meltzer, and Rav Epstein, sat together on the Benkel in the Volozhin Yeshiva. And they were all Talmidim of the Volozhin Yeshiva in the late 19th century. And they all decided within a relatively short time to come to Israel and establish yeshivas here in Israel. So Rabbi Zalman Meltzer came to Israel, and he was the Rosh Yeshiva, was called the Eitz Chaim Yeshiva. Eitz Chaim Yeshiva was one of the most important yeshivas in Israel. And so, for example, my own Rebbe, Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, right? If you asked him who was his Rebbe, he would say Rabbi Zalman Meltzer. Shlomo Zalman Auerbach learned in the Eitz Chaim Yeshiva from Rabbi Zalman Meltzer, and he had a Maseira from Rabbi Zalman Meltzer. So in a sense, I've got a Maseira straight to the Netziv, from Rav Shlomo Zalman through Rabbi Zalman Meltzer back to the Netziv of Volozhin, who himself was a Talmid of Rav Chaim Volozhin and a Talmid of the Vilna Gaon. So the line from the Vilna Gaon and the Lithuanian yeshivas went through several key individuals, and one of them was Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. So Rabbi Zalman Meltzer was also an extremely important Talmid Chacham and Rosh Yeshiva in the 1920s, 30s, 40s in Israel, establishing Eitz Chaim Yeshiva. And the third one, Rav Moshe Mordechai Epstein, was also extremely influential. He became the Rosh Yeshiva of what came to be known later on as the Hebron Yeshiva. The Hebron Yeshiva was really Slobodka. The Slobodka Yeshiva moved from Lithuania to Hebron in 1924. And they had about 200, it was at the time the biggest yeshiva in Israel. The Hebron Yeshiva in 1924 was the biggest yeshiva in the land of Israel, and over 200 top quality Litvisher Talmidim, and the learning there, by all accounts, was something extraordinary. And they decided to come to the city of Hebron, and in a sense, they revived the whole city of Hebron enormously. But sadly, as I'm sure many of you are aware, 5 years later, in 1929, there was an Arab uprising and a massacre, and that destroyed several of the Talmidei Yeshiva were killed in that massacre, and the whole of Jewish Hebron really realized that they were living too precarious a life in Hebron, And anyhow, the Hebron Yeshiva moved to Yerushalayim, but it still called itself Hebron Yeshiva. So Moshe Mordechai Epstein was the founder of the Hebron Yeshiva and the Slobodka Yeshiva, which actually has generated many hundreds of Rabbonim and Dayanim and educators have been products of the Hebron Yeshiva, the Eitz Chaim Yeshiva, and Rav Kook's Yeshiva. So if you think historically, these three rabbis, they were all Talmidim of the Netziv. So the Netziv in some way is responsible for creating such deep roots of Emunah and Talmid and Lomdas and Talmid Chachomim. Of course, these people didn't only learn from the Netziv; they also learned from Chaim Soloveitchik and from Naftali and from the Alter from Slobodka. There were several, but we're focusing now on the Netziv. And Netziv was a key figure, really, in establishing individuals who would then go on to be serious leaders of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. So these three really all sat together in Volozhin and then came together to Eretz Yisrael. What I'd like to have a look at, I'm just going to start it today. We'll look at it more closely next week. But this is the Netziv. In addition to writing a commentary on the Chumash, he also gave us certain introductions. So this is an introduction to Sefer Bereshis. So look what he says here. Look at this, even in the opening line. He says, what is really another name for the book of Bereshis? And my guess is this is a name that most people have never heard of. Zeh HaSefer. He starts off by saying, this book of Bereshis, HaNikra Sefer Bereshis, that's what we call it. Nikra b'fi HaNaviim Sefer HaYosh. And there is another name for Sefer Bereshis, and in several psukim in the Nevi'im, it's referred to under the title of Sefer HaYosh, the book of Yosha. So what he wants to say is Yosha is a word which refers to Yashrus. Yashrus roughly translates as integrity or morality or ethics. It's the book of ethics of the Torah. That's what Sefer HaYoshar means. And where do we see that? We see it in, so he says, Kedisa. We see in Maseches Avodah Zarah Daf Kaf Hey, Al Shnei Mikros b'Sefer Yeshua. There are two psukim in Sefer Yeshua about which it says Halohi Kesuva Al Sefer HaYosha. Twice in the book of Yeshua, so I brought it here in the English translation. One of them is in the miraculous battle that Yeshua had against the 5 kings of Emor, the 5 Amorite kings, right? So there it says that in some way, in some sense, the sun stood still, allowing Yeshua to complete his victory. And in that context, it says, Halo Kosub al Sefer HaYosh. It's written in the book of Yosha. And then there's another that's in the book, that is one of the psukim of Sefer Yeshua. And then he goes on to say, the Netziv, and in the book of Shemuel, it says, Vayomer Lamed Bnei Yehuda Keshes. That from the tribe of Yehuda, we have exceptionally good people who are soldiers, who are experts in archery, in shooting arrows. That's Keshes. That's what Keshes means, is a bow and arrow. So he says, and the pasuk there says, Hidik Suba Sefer Yosha. Right? And we find a reference to that in Sefer Yosha. On a Farish of Yochanan, this is all still the Netziv, quoting the Gemara in Avodah Zarah Cafe. On a Farish of Yochanan, Zeh Sefer Avrom Yitzchak Yaakov, Shenikru Yeshari. There's another name, a sort of a nickname, so to speak, that Chazal ascribed to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, that they are called Yesharim. They are called people of Yashrus. Shanema Thomas Nafshi Mos Yesharim. That Bilam says at the end of his life, right, let me die the death of the Yesharim. Okay, I mean, I'm not going to go into more detail of it now, but it's going to be important for us in the next year. We're going to look at this a bit more closely. The Netziv lays down a foundation based on a Gemara in Avodah Zarah Daf Kaf Hey, that actually the whole underlying theme of Sefer Bereshis is to teach morality and ethics, sometimes referred to as Derech Eretz. The concept of Derech Eretz in the Chazal translates variously in English, but one of the meanings of it is morality and ethics, and that in actual fact, Sefer Bereshis is a book of ethics. And therefore, says the Netziv, we're going to look for ethical behavior of Avrom, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and see it as really laying the foundations going forward of Klal Yisrael. So a little bit, we saw that today in Avrom's refusal to engage in extreme wealth and power following his victory of the battle. He says, no, that's it. I'm not even going to take a shoestring from you. I'm not even going to take a thread from you. You give it back to whoever owned it previously. Avrom expresses this quality of his, a moral and ethical quality of rejecting great power and wealth, on the basis that's not what Klal Yisrael are interested in. That's not our priority. Right? Great power and wealth is an illusion. Right? I'm sure some of you have seen articles. I've certainly seen articles describing the families of lottery winners. What do their lives look like 5 years down the line? And in 9 times out of 10 cases, the lottery win has destroyed their life completely. They've lost their friends, they've lost their family, they've lost everything that was precious to them beforehand, was lost because of the extreme wealth that they attained. So the extreme wealth is an illusion. And Avrom is teaching us this in Lech Lecha, and the Netziv is going to tell us, and that's part of the yashrus of Avrom Avinu, that he got his priorities straight, and that he is not tempted or dazzled by the prospect of great wealth and power. That's it for today, ladies and gentlemen. That's the end of the share for today. Nice to see you all as always. Nice to see you here. Henry, nice to see you here.